Okay, it is showtime. I am now live. I was not live before when I thought I was. Still setting some things up. Still trying to get ready. Hopefully everything is working. Hopefully it sounds okay. There's a link to join if you would like to join, which would be very helpful. I'll explain what I'm doing in a second. Okay. Lord, I ask, because you are watching over us, that your wisdom guide us, that this study not lead to divisions and disagreements, and that I'm not alone in this study, so that I am not tempted to toward private interpretation. Amen. So this study that I'm trying to do here, I decided to start in Mark. I've already started it on my own a little bit just to get in the habit of what I'm going to be doing. But that was a long time ago. But I haven't done it necessarily with Mark yet. I did it with Matthew, and I'll go over that next time, probably, depending on how long this takes, because I don't have all day. I'm going to be taking notes because I feel that that is important to a study. If you're not taking notes, if you're not thinking of questions to ask and not trying to look up connections, informations, get those questions answered, then you're not really studying, you're just reading. But I don't want to do just a read, and I do have trouble speaking right now. And it will be starting in Mark 14, but we're looking specifically at the crucifixion and what the Gospels say about it, including, if we get that far, Acts and beyond in the New Testament, as other writers have mentioned the crucifixion and details about it. I'm not trying to come up with any conclusions, just mostly gathering information. I don't want to present a theory that I'm not trying to prove any theory about anything, any dates or truthfulness to anything. I just want to gather information, look at it, analyze it, and then see what the information itself says. Now, this is going to be very difficult if I do happen to be doing this alone, because it can get quite tiring. I might be missing a bunch of things, and I might even lead towards conclusions that, you know, are false or misleading, or I am being misled by something. I don't know. Obviously, I do have prior information. If you've followed my channel, that should be obvious, or seen me in other places. I will try not to draw on that prior information as I do this study, because it's supposed to be sort of a fresh looking at the words and taking notes on what is written. And then, but if somebody out there does have information to add, I would like them to add that information. Go ahead and let me know, or join to the link. and we can talk about it. I would like to not, so I'm using the resource BibleGateway.com. I would like this to not have ads, but it's going to have an ad on the side. I might be able to not have to worry about that. I'm sorry about the clicking. Can I move me? Hold on. Just put me over here in front of the ad. For now. We're real small in the corner here. Yeah. Update layout. Okay. Let me know if you can read that. It's hard for me to read. I don't have my glasses with me. So starting in 14, and I have some of these notes already taken as well. I can show you those because they're on the same thing here, which is I have 1 through 2, 3, and this is where I can put my little notes for things to describe what's going on. And the second iteration of notes is going to include probably like an Excel spreadsheet or something because it'd be easier to keep track of it, where I put events in chronological order according to what I can deduce that this says. So this is going through this Mark, and then there's Mark 15. So I could read from this. It'd be easier to see, but I think it'd be fine to read from this. So Mark 14 opens, if you want to look where we were before in 13, he's talking about the destruction of the temple. This is that, they just come out of the temple. So in Mark, is it Mark 11 or Mark 12? As they're going into the temple, Jesus sees a fig tree. It doesn't give them any fruit, so he curses it. And then they go in. The disciples take note of it. And then when they leave, he talks about the temple's destruction. And then, there's also the lesson of the fig tree that he includes in it. So after that, what Mark gets to is this very seemingly point by point chronological telling that leads up to the crucifixion and the empty tomb. So he starts in 14. It was now 2 days before the Passover and the feast of unleavened bread. And the chief priest and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, "Not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people." So a couple things that I'm thinking just right off the bat. So it was 2 days before the Passover, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. We should take notes of that and think about it while this train goes by and I mute myself. That would have been a great opportunity for someone else to talk. All right. So 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, I've looked into what the Passover is, and I've looked into what the Feast of Unleavened Bread is, but also trying to understand what they mean by 2 days before. I've always had trouble with measurements, but it seems to be slightly ambiguous no matter what you're looking into, English or Greek, when they say 2 days. It could be in 2 days, after 2 days, before 2 days. That when you say 2 days, you could be including the day that you're saying that, and the next day, and then the thing happens, or you could be including the day that you're saying that, and the next day it happens, or you could be saying that you're not including that day that you're saying this, and then there are 2 days, and then it happens on the day after. It's just, it's not technically relevant yet, because what this is saying, it's not trying to give us a time of when the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread is, because we don't have much of a time before that, except that they were just in the temple, right? But it's not a direct continuation from them being in the temple either. We don't have anything that says now, after he had said these things, they were on the road and it was 2 days before. Like, that's not in there. This is just setting up what is happening right now in verses 1 and 2. And what's happening in verses 1 and 2? And the chief priests and the scribes were seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him, for they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. Now, are they saying not to arrest him by stealth and kill him during the feast? Or is this them saying that their conspiracy talk not take place during the Passover and the feast? Or, well, during the feast, because that's what they said. And then my question goes to, okay, what is this feast? The Feast of Unleavened Bread. Now, I've had to look that up too. Now, he is mentioning the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And when I've looked up the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I found not conflicting information, not contradictory information, but just confusing information. And I don't have the resources right now. I'm just mentioning what I found. Where there's a preparation day, much like any day before a feast or before a holy day, you prepare for the next day because you can't do the preparing on that day. The Feast of Unleavened Bread has a much more involved preparation because you can't have any leaven in your home. So preparing for that, like it could take place 2 days before, where you have to remove all the leaven from your home. But it's also the Feast of Unleavened Bread. There is preparation, and then there's a meal, and then there are 7 days of feasts for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a week-long event. And the Passover lands in there. And then Pentecost is 50 days after. So if the Passover is on a Saturday, then Pentecost will be on a Sunday because it's 50 days after. 49 days after would be again on a Saturday. But as for the Feast of Unleavened Bread, it's not going to start on the same day. So the Feast of Unleavened Bread does not start on a Saturday, but the Saturday takes place within the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And these things are also determined by the full moon and the barley harvest and things like that. So while other people will be able to explain that further, I would look to somebody who has gathered the information and presented it visually to better understand what's going on. But I'm just thinking, while looking at this, and then the next verse, and while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper. So it was now 2 days before, and the chief priest, and while he was at Bethany. So he is here at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper 2 days before the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover. So 2 days before is, see, the Passover Seder meal involves a lot of steps. So if it's 2 days before the Passover, and the Passover is the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that kind of makes sense as to why they would say the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread 2 days before these two things took place. And also why we would have Passover first in the translation, though I'm not sure that it necessarily needs to be first in the translation. It could say the Feast of Unleavened Bread and the Passover 2 days before. But I didn't look into the Greek there. And the only thing that I would have as a clue, because I have a very, very small knowledge of the Greek language, is if the Passover or Feast of Unleavened Bread has a case ending that ties it back to the 2 days before. Something like that. It says the 2 days before applies to one or the other. But if neither of them have it, or if they both have it, then, which I don't think either of them would have it because of the nature of the word, or the nature of, you know, what those things are, the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And they don't say the Passover, they don't say the Seder meal, they just say the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread. So even the Passover could be seen as the week, and they could be saying the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread as one thing. But I see it as, right now, as I'm reading this, the chief priests and the scribes are seeking how to arrest him by stealth and kill him 2 days before. And the reason they're doing it 2 days before is because they said, not during the feast, lest there be an uproar from the people. So they're not going to have this meeting during the Passover or the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I'm trying to see a connection of them saying that they're not going to arrest him during these things. But then, I mean, it creates from, you know, knowledge that I have about what's going to happen. The spoiler here is that Jesus and his disciples have the Passover Seder meal, and then he is arrested. So why would Mark include this comment not during the feast if it's talking about the arrest? Because that's what they do. They don't arrest him before. But they do have their meeting before. where they were seeking to do this. So, not jotting down any notes right now, but my questions would be specifically about the Passover, what it means to be 2 days before Passover, the Feast of Unleavened Bread, just to really draw all that information out and see what it's actually saying. And then to ask some people about the not during the feast comment, if that makes sense. As a writer, what I'm seeing is that that comment is related to them not holding this meeting during the feast, because they do arrest him after what appears to be the Seder meal. So continuing on, just to have those thoughts in our heads. If you were taking notes, that's good. And while he was at Bethany in the house of Simon the leper, as he was reclining at the table, a woman came with an alabaster flask of ointment of pure nard, very costly. And she broke the flask and poured it over his head. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the oil wasted like that? For this ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor." And they scolded her. But Jesus said, "Leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me, for you will always have the poor with you. And whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. And truly, I say to you, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her." So I think this is quite an interesting thing, not just because this takes place 2 days before the feast and everything, but because this woman who brings this flask, it's very expensive. She paid for this, although nobody says when she paid for it. But it's it's this very expensive flask. They say that it could have been sold. They don't say anything about the money itself having been put to a better use, but rather that this flask could have been sold. So it's quite possible that it's also interesting that I didn't take notes on 4, 5, 6, and 7. So let me go back to this. Because I'm looking specifically at the crucifixion, but at the same time, I'm seeing something a little new here. There were some who said to themselves indignantly, "Why was the ointment wasted like that?" I'm finding it very interesting, and it brings up some questions, but it also makes me think that this ointment was something that they had for longer than a couple days or a couple weeks. That they had this ointment. It was very expensive, and the ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. Now, there are some translations. There's probably a note here that say, how many wages. A denarius was a day's wage for a laborer. So she had 300 days. She had it's a year's salary, basically. That paid for this. But they don't say the money that paid for this could have been given to the poor and taken care of the poor. They say that the ointment itself could have been sold. So it doesn't sound like they think that she bought this to do this, but rather that she had this, and instead of selling it, she used it on Jesus's head. And then they scold her. So they said to themselves indignantly, amongst themselves, they're saying, like, why was this ointment used like that? So ointment could have been sold for more than 300 denarii and given to the poor. And then they scold her. So they all confirmed with one another, that what she was doing was wrong. And then they directed it at her, which is where Jesus chimes in and says, leave her alone. Why do you trouble her? She has done a beautiful thing to me. For you will always have the poor with you, and whenever you want, you can do good for them. But you will not always have me. I mean, it's an interesting lesson, but not specifically related to the crucifixion. What's related to the crucifixion is what he says next. She has done what she could. She has anointed my body beforehand for burial. Now, if you didn't know what was going to happen, that might come as a shock, reading that for the first time and being like, whoa, wait a minute. So she had this very expensive alabaster flask that she broke open and poured over his head. Everyone is like talking to themselves about how wrong that was and what it could have been used for. It could have been sold, and that money could have been used to help people. And then Jesus says, no, no, no. She's anointed me for my burial. We got 2 days before this feast. He's already being anointed for his burial. The spices and the ointments and things like that. Now, that would be a bad practice if you knew someone was going to die in, sort of a bloody way, beaten, flogged, and crucified, because that ointment's not going to still be there. And ointments like that are used to clean the body before you wrap them. And so the ointments and the spices and all that stuff for burial preparation. But this also means that she knew that he was about to die. She knew. She didn't guess. It's not something that she's like, well, he said, these things, and they meant he was going to die. So, I'm going to do this. It's a very expensive flask. There's something there. And they even say, wherever the gospel is proclaimed in the whole world, what she has done will be told in memory of her. Yeah, we're talking about this because she anointed him for what is to come. And the rest of his disciples, although they knew that going into Jerusalem was basically a death sentence, and he had been telling them over and over in various ways, in sort of coded ways and different things, using parables and anecdotes, that he was going to his death. But they didn't really understand. So verse 10, then Judas Iscariot, who was one of the 12, went to the chief priest in order to betray him to them. So because the next verse after 11 here, that verse 12 says, on the first day of unleavened bread, this Judas Iscariot thing that he does here It could have taken place on the same day that Jesus was anointed for his burial. It could have taken place the next day. If the 2 days, depending on how that's said and what that's actually referring to, because the very next thing is and on the first day. So now we know that the day has started, but what day has started? Because part of that conflicting information that I was talking about was the first day of unleavened bread includes the day before the week of unleavened bread or the feast of unleavened bread, because that's the day that you prepare for it. But wait a minute. When they sacrifice the Passover lamb, so now we know what the first day of unleavened bread is. If you know when they sacrifice the Passover lamb, then the first day of unleavened bread is when they do that. Which, if somebody wants to chime in there, correct me if I'm wrong, but I do believe that is the day of preparing before the actual feast when you sacrifice the lamb. Not that it's been done yet, but that this is the day when that happens. So back to 10. Back to 11. And when they heard it, they were glad and promised to give him money. This is the chief priest that Judas went to talk to. And he saw an opportunity to betray him. So now Judas is looking for his opportunity. So he has time before this happens. So again, it could still be on the same day that Jesus was anointed in Bethany. It could be the day after. And if it is the day after, if they're saying, 2 days before is the day that they're saying it, and then the next day, and then the feast starts, then this is the same day that follows here in verse 12. Or it could be not including that day, and then there are 2 days, and then the feast starts the next day. But either way, there's a time period there that we're kind of loosely given, and we can follow along. Just possibilities right now. So continuing on, and the first day of unleavened bread, when they sacrificed the Passover lamb, his disciples said to him, "Where will you have us go and prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Well, there you go. There is them talking about what happens on the first day of unleavened bread. Twice. They're giving two descriptors. One, it's the day that the Passover lamb is sacrificed. And two, it is the day that you prepare to eat the Passover. Okay. And they ask him where they're going to go to prepare this meal. And he sent 2 of his disciples and said to them, "Go into the city, and a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him. And wherever he enters, say to the master of the house, 'The teacher says, where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' And he will show you a large upper room, furnished and ready. There prepare for us." So by this time, I imagine, possibly because of like media and things like that have betrayed these types of events, that when they say to this person, they just go into the city and see someone carrying a jar of water who will meet them, and they follow them. Now, this is just a very little amount of information about who this person is right now. They're carrying a jar of water. they're coming back into the city. They're going back to, put this water where its destination is, which is their house, it seems. Now, he doesn't say to introduce themselves to this person, but rather this person carrying the water is going back to their master, and that's who they introduce themselves to. And how do they introduce themselves? The teacher says. Like, that's what they say to the master. So this person might just know who they're referring to when they say the teacher says. They might be somebody that has heard Jesus talk and knows the disciples, maybe. And so when they say this, they're ready to welcome him in. And they have, this room where this Passover is going to be had, and that is what he is offering to them to prepare the meal. Where is my guest room, where I may eat the Passover with my disciples? So that is what their teacher's message is to this person. And Jesus says, and he will show you a large upper room furnished and ready. There prepare for us. So they're not just going there to find the place. They're going there to find the place that they will then prepare the meal on this day, the first day of unleavened bread. So I think that's pretty good support throughout these verses to say that the first day of unleavened bread, that this was talking about 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread, but they don't say 2 days, or the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, just the first day of unleavened bread is the day where all these things are prepared because the feast is about to start. So they go and they prepare. Continuing on, and when it was evening, he came with the 12. This is also interesting. He says he sent 2 of his disciples, and when it was evening, he came with the 12. So he didn't send the apostles to do this. He just sent 2 other disciples, 2 other followers of his, because all of the 12 go with him in the evening to this place. And if it is now evening and they are using the sunset to sunset calendar, then it is now the week. This is the Passover, because the day before they sacrificed the Passover lamb. So you don't sacrifice the lamb and then wait a couple days. This is it. So this is the Seder meal that they're having. And if I were to go into details about what the Seder meal includes, there's, I don't remember how many steps. There could be like 15 because there's a lot. But there's a cup, there's bread, there's singing, there's another cup, there's more bread, there's more singing, there's telling of stories, and another cup, and and then there's, I think there's 4 cups in total that you drink, and by cup they'll have a pitcher of wine that they spread out for the table. They refill the wine and come back and they spread it out. And as they were reclining at the table and eating, Jesus said, "Truly I say to you, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me." And they began to be sorrowful and said to him one after another, "Is it I?" He said to them, "It is one of the 12. Oh, see, that's interesting right there. because I mentioned earlier that he sent, or they wrote earlier that he sent 2 disciples, and then later the 12 arrived with him. So here mentioning he said to them, it is one of the 12, is sort of a clarifying, because at first he says, one of you will betray me, one who is eating with me. So he's eating with more than just the 12. He has other disciples with him. But now he narrows it down because everyone's talking, all of his disciples who are there with him for this meal, possibly even the master of the house. I find it hard to believe that the master of the house would be hosting the meal and then not be included in the meal. But there's also people serving them as well for this meal, bringing the food to the table and things like that. But they're all there asking, is it me? Am I betraying? They're not asking, is it you? Are you going to be the one? Like, they're actually doubting their own resolve in this because they believe what Jesus says when he says that one of them will betray him. Think, am I going to do it? Now, they don't know if it's going to be them, but that's why they're asking. They're asking each other. They say to him and one after another, all right. They began to be sorrowful and say to him one after another, is it I? So they're all asking him if it's them. They want clarification. He said to them, it is one of the 12. So then, I mean, if you're not one of the 12, your sorrow is going to be turning to the 12 because now you're just thinking, oh, these people who are very close to him, who are his select apostles that were sent out to carry his message. One of them's going to be doing it. One who is dipping bread into the dish with me. I'm not sure what that means. I don't have that kind of information. I've seen it depicted a couple times. I've heard explanations, but for me personally, I don't have that retained. But it could be somebody who's sitting right next to him. This dish could be in the middle of the table. He could just be saying this in 2 different ways. One of the 12, one who's dipping bread into the dish with me, because all 12 of them could be doing it. I don't know. For the Son of Man For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. For the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. Goes. Now that is confusing even in English. One who is eating with me. I don't think I included 21 here. But woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. Oh, well, there you go. Read a little bit further and you get an explanation as to what it means to say the Son of Man goes as it is written of him. Because all along he's been very cryptic about his death. And even now, for the Son of Man goes, but woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. So he goes because he is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. Better for that man if he had not been born. So to think about how harmful, how self-harmful it is to betray someone. He doesn't say it'd be better for the world. He doesn't say it'd be better for all of us. He doesn't say it'd be better for me. He says it'd be better for that man. Woe to that man by whom the Son of Man is betrayed. It would have been better for that man if he had not been born. So also, this is a guarantee because it is written of him and it will happen. It's a sorrowful thing as well that he does this. Does anyone have anything that they want to add, any questions that they want to ask at this point? I think I've made some good progress, but my lungs hurt and I don't think I can continue to talk by myself for much longer. Need a good rest. No? All right. I'll go a little further just to kind of get through some more of this. Just read it through, not really ponder so much about it. In verse 22 up here. And as they were eating, he took bread, and after blessing it, broke it and gave it to them, and said, "Take, this is my body." A really good resource to have here would be the steps, like all the things that are included in the Seder meal. You get a little bit better visual of where this takes place if you're looking at Luke's account of this, because he includes a prior step before he gets to the bread, because there's a cup, there's bread, then there's a cup again in Luke. So when you actually look at the steps of this Seder meal, you can see there's just a little bit more insight to what Jesus is saying when he blesses this bread and gives it to his disciples. Because the bread itself at this point in the meal holds a significance to something that happened in their past. The Israelite past, the Hebrews, and because this meal is significant to their exodus from Egypt. And not to get into a different study, which is the study of the Lord's Supper, but just to understand what he's saying in this moment, because he is giving new significance to this meal that they're having as they're having it. And he took a cup, and when he had given thanks, right here, he gave it to them, and they all drank of it. And he said to them, This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many. And then again, if you look at the significance of the last cup of wine that they drink, which I think this is the last cup of wine that they drink for what it's about to say is going to happen after this. During that meal, he's giving new meaning. It's still very much related to the original meaning, but this whole event here is sort of that that idea that they're saying Moses said that someone would come after him who is like him but better, and things like that, would make a new covenant. Well, here he is making that new covenant. He is that typological second Moses, but he's better than Moses because his promises are better and the things that he's giving them are better. And you see that in John 6 when he explains a little bit differently to the people, the bread from heaven, but I give you better bread, the water that Moses gave you, but I give you living water, and things like that. So even here, he's saying, this bread that he's blessed and given to them is his body, and this blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many, is his blood. Truly I say to you, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it in the new kingdom of God. See, this I would say, take a note of this specifically, this verse here. Now, I have a little bit of information that would be a spoiler right now, but I'm not going to give you that. But I just want you to take note of that specifically, that he says, I will not drink again of the fruit of the vine until that day when I drink it new in the kingdom of God. Because that will come up again, but probably not for a couple weeks. Unless I just blaze through this or have somebody who can read faster. So this is why I think this could be the final cup just on its own, not including the significance of the cup and the bread during this meal. Because verse 26, and when they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. So even in this Seder meal at the very end, after the last cup, there is a hymn sung, and then the night is the meal is over. And this is what it's saying right here. When they had sung a hymn, they went out to the Mount of Olives. Now, it's not saying that followed right after the cup and what Jesus was saying. But in the writing, in the timeline of what's being written here, it does follow it. And this singing of the hymn and then them going out is that meal being over. And Jesus said to them, you will all fall away, for it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered. But after I am raised up, I will go before you to Galilee. So he's telling them that they're going to be going to Galilee, and he will also be going there after he is raised up. He wants them to be there because they're all going to scatter. And now that they are all here, before they scatter, they need to know what to do. Where will they see him again? And saying these things all before it happened, letting them know, just like moments before, just everything gets set off. And although Mark doesn't include it, we know that Judas was already looking for a moment to betray him. And the other accounts will tell us a little bit more about that, what he was doing in this time when he had heard Jesus speak that one of them will betray him and that it will be one of the 12. Now, it doesn't seem like everyone heard what Jesus says to Judas, and not trying to go off of Mark here to something else, but just adding a little bit of information. I think you'd see it a little bit clearer when we actually read that the disciples, while they're there and they're eating and they hear him say this, they don't quite catch what was said, because it was said to Judas, not to the others, because Jesus says, go do what you have to do. And then there's just like, well, they thought maybe Judas was going to go do this or go do that. But he had just told them that one of them will betray him. And then he tells Judas, go do what you have to do. So it seems like there was a lot going on, and there is a lot going on during this meal, and they didn't catch all of it. Peter said to him, even though they fall away, I will not. And Jesus said to him, truly I tell you, this very night. And I would take a note of that too, that he's telling them this night. So they've just finished the meal. So it's 2 days before the conspiracy begins to arrest him. Judas goes to talk to the high priest. So now they have somebody on the inside, so they're good there as far as they know. Judas starts seeking an opportunity. The day of preparation there, where they prepare for the Passover, where the lamb is slaughtered. So it could be the next day, it could be the day after. But it's the day before that week begins. They go, they find the location that this is going to take place, and they prepare. So I'm thinking that already the master of the house, they're bringing water into the house. One of the servants is bringing water into the house, but the master of the house has already prepared his house to remove the leaven from the house. That's just me suspecting. If not, then they had to do that. But I think that happens earlier. I think even the meal that he has at Bethany, where he is anointed, that the leaven was already probably removed from that house. Someone will have to confirm that, or you'll have to look that up to see how long it took to do that, what that involves, and for how long the leaven was removed. But that's not really important to this. But they prepare, and then that evening they have this meal, and then also that evening they go to the Mount of Olives after they sing the hymn, and also that evening he tells them that they'll all scatter, and then also that evening he tells Peter that that very night Peter will deny him 3 times. Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times. And if you want to look up this whole rooster crowing thing, there's 3 crows during a night. There's a crow around midnight. There's a crow about an hour before sunbreak, and then there's a crow at sunbreak. So the rooster will crow 3 times. But if he's only talking about 2 crows, he's talking about the one before, an hour before sunbreak, and the one at sunbreak. I don't know why Mark doesn't include the one at midnight. Maybe he doesn't need to, but it's just interesting that that one's not included. Please don't take my word for that. Go confirm that yourself if that seems important to you. You can look up the study. I don't have the resources with me, and I apologize. Or just completely ignore what I'm saying. That's also fine. So go ahead and give that some thought. Somebody was knocking at my door. Okay, it was just a package. So what was I saying? Right, I was putting down the timeline. So he they prepare that evening. They have the meal that evening. They go to the Mount of Olives that evening. He tells Peter that that evening, that while the sun is still down, Peter will deny him 3 times. And we know that the denial, we haven't read it yet, but we know that the denial takes place during Jesus's trial. And then the next day, he is crucified. So when the sun is up, he is crucified, basically. It doesn't say the next day. I'm just saying for us, our timeline would be during daybreak is when he is crucified. So they have the meal, and then he's crucified. But it's that sunlight to sunlight, or sundown to sundown, then he's crucified on the day that they have the Passover Seder meal. Where they eat the lamb, but Jesus uses the bread as the example for his body, not the lamb. Because they probably already ate the lamb when he gives this example. But again, it goes back to the significance of the bread during that ceremony, that feast. But he said empathetically, if I must die with you, I will not deny you. And they all said the same. So Peter here, again, not understanding, it's quite a thing to think, even way back when they're like, they begin to ask him one after another, or say to him one after another, is it I? Peter here, like hearing everyone's going to scatter, and he's thinking, I won't scatter. If I have to die, I'll die with you. But Jesus already told him that, he's going to scatter. He's going to deny him 3 times. And then they all were following with Peter saying, yeah, hey, me too. Me too. I'm not going to leave. It's interesting that all of this is included to say that, I mean, he's telling them to their face what's going to happen, and they still don't get it. They're still messing up. They're still failing to understand. But it's also like, do you actually, it's still a good example. Because even though it still happens to them, isn't that who we want to be? Is somebody who works hard to please God. Like, Peter's not doing this because he doesn't respect Jesus's words or believe that this is going to happen. He's doing this because he doesn't want to deny Jesus, not especially not while he's there. That's what I think. And then when the time actually comes, he's lost. I would imagine that anxiety takes over, and that instinct of his when being questioned outside of the trial is to just say, no, I don't know him. I'm not part of this. I'm just here staying warm by the fire. And they went to a place called Gethsemane. And he said to his disciples, sit here while I pray. And he took with him Peter and James and John, and began to be greatly distressed and troubled. And he said to them, my soul is very sorrowful, even to death. Remain here and watch. And going a little farther, he fell on the ground and prayed that, if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. Luke gives us a little bit more detail on this too. From whatever perspective Luke has, whether it be a medical perspective or, as some have been suspecting recently, a very Jewish perspective. There's something significant about, there's something significant related to this idea that Jesus is asking for the cup to pass from him. But here he says, if it be possible, the hour might pass from him. So I would take a note of that so that we can compare what Jesus is saying here with what Luke records, what Luke is trying to show. But it'll still come up here as well. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me. So there's the cup language. Yet not what I will, but what you will. And he came and found them sleeping. Now, I imagine just from that comment, and he came and found them sleeping, that Jesus said a lot more that wasn't recorded, because Mark is taking eyewitness accounts and things like that, things that people have remembered and writing them down. So if no one heard the rest of his prayer because they fell asleep, then we don't have the rest of his prayer. But what we do have is what was relayed to the person who wrote this down. That he said, or he prayed that if it were possible, the hour might pass from him. And he said, Abba, Father, all things are possible for you. Remove this cup from me, yet not what I will, but what you will. So what was his prayer? That the hour passed from him. And what did he say? Remove this cup from me. I think that's a pretty big clue as to what it means to remove the cup, to have the hour pass. But it's still missing a lot of context as to what the cup is and what the hour is and what passing means. But if you have that written down in your notes, so write that down in your copybook, we can look at what else is said about the cup and about the hour and the passing and things like that later, and we can get a better understanding of what this language means, what is being said here. Because I've heard a lot of different views on this, a lot of different explanations as to what these things are, and none of them handle anything other, well, okay, not none, but most of the time what I hear, a majority agree upon one thing, and it doesn't have any connection to like these first century terms for Jewish people. But when I do hear about the first century connections of Jewish people, I start to understand a little bit more about what he's asking. I don't have a great understanding of it. But that's why we're doing this together, so that we can learn together and see a little bit more about it. And now I know why my picture of myself was over there, because I'm looking that way. Sorry about that. I want you to be able to follow my eyes to what I'm reading. And he came and found them sleeping. And he said to Peter, "Simon, are you asleep? Could you not watch 1 hour? Watch and pray that you may not enter into temptation." So even now, he's giving Peter that opportunity to understand what is about to happen, so that he follow along, that he does not enter into temptation. I'm thinking that temptation is the temptation to deny Christ. If he had stayed awake and prayed with him, there's a possibility, as what I'm reading here and thinking that I'm getting from what Jesus is saying here, that Peter could avoid denying him. But that's not what happens. Why? Well, because the spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak. Even Jesus right here understands the importance of prayer for Peter, because his flesh is weak. He's falling asleep. He's going to deny Christ. But the Spirit is willing. He's asking him to let the Spirit strengthen him so that he can do these things. And again he went away and prayed, saying the same words. And again he came and found them sleeping, for their eyes were very heavy, and they did not know what to answer him. Well, they spent a good deal of time preparing a meal during the daylight hours. It's, I think, according to the other accounts, that because the first crow of the rooster, the midnight crow, has not happened yet, that it's approaching midnight. So they have been awake for a while. And he's just asking them to stay awake 1 more hour to hear his prayer. Well, they're about to be awake for a lot longer, because they haven't gotten any sleep after this meal, except for those who had fallen asleep here during his prayer, for their eyes were heavy. And when he came back to them and saw that they were sleeping, they didn't know what to say, because he's already told them, how important it is that they stay awake and hear what he has to say, what he is praying. And he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking your rest? It is enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." It doesn't even say that. I think this is kind of funny. It doesn't say that he went away and prayed the same thing. It says that he came the third time and said to them, "Are you still sleeping and taking a rest?" So it's almost like he came back to them the second time after beginning the same prayer, found them sleeping, woke them up, and as soon as he turned around, they fell back asleep. And he went and prayed and came back and they were asleep again. And then he says, "It's enough. The hour has come. The Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us be going. See, my betrayer is at hand." And immediately, while he was still speaking, "Rise, let us be going. See," while he was still speaking, Judas came, one of the 12, and with him a crowd with swords and clubs from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. "My betrayer is at hand." Now the betrayer had given them a sign, saying, "The one I will kiss is the man. Seize him and lead him away under guard." And when he came, he went up to him at once and said, "Rabbi," and he kissed him. And they laid hands on him and seized him. But one of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. And Jesus said to them, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me? Day after day I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me. But let the scriptures be fulfilled." And they all left him and fled. The scattering that he was talking about earlier of the disciples right there. This is that scattering. Now we do know that some of them didn't flee far as they kind of hang around and follow and stand outside the court and everything. One of those who stood by drew his sword and struck the servant of the high priest and cut off his ear. We don't get the account of what happens after that exactly, but Jesus does reply, "Have you come out against a robber with swords and clubs to capture me?" Saying it's ridiculous that they brought all this force to do something when it seems like they could have just asked him to come with them. Like, come with us. But they're making a spectacle of it. He has these people around him, his disciples and his 12. And we know that they have two swords with them. These swords are things that you would use for like camping and wilderness survival, things like that. They're not warrior swords. We hear the word sword and think of, something battle ready and, medieval most of the time, things like that, or even Roman, but they didn't have Roman swords amongst them here. And it is the crowd with their own swords and clubs are from the chief priests and the scribes and the elders. They didn't enlist the Romans to come take him. And then Jesus says something very interesting. Day after day, I was with you in the temple teaching, and you did not seize me, but let the scriptures be fulfilled. He's saying, I was there. I read from the scroll of Isaiah. I was in your temples. I was teaching. You did nothing. So why do you come against me now? But you know what? This is the way it was written, so it's going to happen. So let's do it. Again, showing that he knows what has to happen. They didn't have to bring all this out just to capture him. And then a young man flees. And because Mark is the one who writes this, but the others don't record this, I think that's why a lot of people will say that this is Mark, the young man. The young man followed him. So they're taking him away, right? They come, they've captured him. The disciples have scattered. And then a young man followed him with nothing but a linen cloth around his body, and they seized him. So this group with these swords and these clubs who have come to arrest Jesus, they see this boy probably trying to sneak around, not being very sneaky, only clothed with the linen cloth, and they try to seize him, but he slips out of the linen cloth. But he left the linen cloth and ran away naked. Just a little side comment, and so people say that's probably Mark. Mark's like self-inserting him here. I think it's possible. And the others don't record it because they weren't eyewitnesses to this, and they're not, sure whether or not this happened. So why include this thing that Mark mentions that they don't get from any other witness? That could also support the idea that Mark is the young man that tried to follow and saw this happening. And they led Jesus to the high priest, and all the chief priests and the elders and the scribes came together. And Peter had followed him at a distance. Because remember, they all scattered, but I said, some of them didn't scatter too far. Peter following even further behind the young man, I guess, because he didn't get caught. Nobody tried to grab him. But he did follow at a distance, right into the courtyard of the high priest. And he was sitting with the guards and warming himself at the fire. Now the chief priest and the whole council were seeking testimony against Jesus to put him to death, but they found none. For many bore false witness against him, but their testimony did not agree. So it was easy to tell that they were giving lies because it wasn't consistent. They weren't telling, the same story. They could have said, "Oh, on this day at this time he was here doing this," and somebody else comes in and says, "Well, on the same day, the same time." That would be quite suspicious, and you could tell that it was false witness. Or they could say that, he did this, and then somebody else says, "Well, he did this," and even if one of them were true, you couldn't believe them because they're conflicting words. But they had nothing, they found nothing in these testimonies to which they could put him to death. I think they're talking about stoning there because, even I think what I read is that even though they did stone people to death, they technically couldn't, according to the Romans. Like, the Romans wouldn't let them execute people, but they still kind of did it anyway. And sometimes, somebody could survive a stoning, although you probably wouldn't want to. It would leave you in a very bad state. I'd imagine. And some stood up and bore false witness against him, saying, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. So that's interesting, because he says they bore false witness saying that we heard him say, I will destroy this temple. And they're right that it's false witness, because Jesus didn't say he will destroy the temple that is built with hands and build another that is not made with hands. He said that it will be destroyed. And he also said, if you destroy this temple, talking about his body, then I will rebuild it. But he never spoke about rebuilding the temple that would be destroyed, as in the temple in Jerusalem. He spoke about his body being rebuilt. So it's a very interesting idea. Was it false witness by design? Or because they did say, we heard him say, or was it misunderstanding? Like, did they give false witness because they just didn't understand what he was saying and they didn't remember it correctly? Or, a faulty memory thing where they're like, oh, this is what he was talking about. He was going to destroy the temple and stuff like that. Or were they thinking, I know how to get him. I'll use some of the things that he said, but make it scary. He said he was going to destroy the temple. I don't know, but either way, it was false witness, because that is not what he said. Yet even about this, their testimony did not agree. I wonder in what way. Because if you are making this up, we heard him say, I will destroy this temple that is made with hands, and in 3 days I will build another not made with hands. There's many different things that they could all say differently that would not agree with that. They could have said, you will destroy this temple that is made with hands. He said, you will destroy the temple. He said the temple will be destroyed. But either way, they couldn't get it straight amongst themselves. They're not in a back room getting their story straight and agreeing with one another. They're bringing in these people who didn't understand what he said, or are intentionally being deceitful with what he said. And because a lie can be anything, you can't predict it. You can't predict what people are going to say. But you can predict what somebody is going to say when they're saying the truth. If you can say, oh, this person will say this, it might be the truth. Because that's easy to predict if they're going to tell the truth. If they're going to lie, it could be anything. But I already said that. And the high priest stood up in the midst and asked Jesus, have you no answer to make? What is it that these men testify against you? But he remained silent and made no answer. Again, the high priest asked him, are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? Well, that's interesting. Why is there no note on that? I don't know if it's Mark or not, but this question, it should say Blessed One. But I guess if blessed is still referring to the same thing, they're asking him if he's the Son of the Lord. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One? There's only one Blessed One. They're kind of calling back to an Old Testament scripture there. And if there was a note, I could pull it up for you, but it's not here. And I don't have those resources. Again, I apologize. And Jesus said, I am. Well, he gave an answer. Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed? I am, he says. Well, there you go. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power See, that's interesting right there as well. That would be a good note to take just for other types of references and things that we're looking at later. But he says, you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of power. Because the power language, I think power is Psalm 110, but he's in this phrase and coming with the clouds of heaven. He's making combination of Psalm 110 and the Daniel 7 Son of Man taking his, or coming to the Ancient of Days, or coming like the Ancient of Days to take his seat. Because his word power here, because that's not in Daniel. But I think the coming with the clouds of heaven is, I think that's not in Psalm 110. I can't remember if it's Son of Man or clouds of heaven. I think there was a one like a Son of Man mentioned instead of just the Son of Man. But he's saying seated at the right hand, not taking a seat. But coming with the clouds of heaven. There's also a connection that I've seen the clouds of heaven with the Father's angels, like clouds of heaven and Father's angels, or his angels. Those are like interchangeable phrases. I've seen that before. If you want to take a note of that as well, see if you can find that connection as well elsewhere. And the high priest tore his garment. And I've seen that depicted in media too, after hearing Jesus say that, I am, and, the right hand of power, and the high priest just, what further witness do we need? You have heard his blasphemy. What is your decision? And they all condemned him as deserving death. Now, although Mark says they all condemned him, I know Matthew, and I ignore the notes here. But between 57 and 74 in Matthew 26, which I didn't write down, but I do have it sort of that there was one, Joseph of Arimathea, who was against this decision. So he was in the court during this time, but he did not agree. And that's recorded by Matthew. I don't know if it's recorded by Luke because I haven't gotten to remember all of the details in Luke, or enough of the details in Luke. But I think that should be interesting when we actually take notes on that. It's not that, I mean, they all condemned him as deserving death. I don't think there's any reason to say that, oh, well, that's a contradiction. He says that they all condemned him. I mean, it's a general statement from witness accounts. They all condemned him. If he's part of the court and the court decides something, then even his, denial or his refusal to accept the decision is still him condemning them because he couldn't stop them. And some began to spit on him and cover his face and to strike him, saying to him, prophesy. And the guards received him with blows. and the guards received him with blows. This statement is not talking about what actually happened. So there's a lot more here than what is said here, because they take him to Herod to also have like a sort of a mini trial during this night as well, because Herod's the king, whatever, and he's beaten and flogged there and spit on, and his clothes are divided. And then they take him back to Caiaphas, where he's received with blows. And as Peter was below in the courtyard, one of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." Now, for storytelling purposes, the court scene is told. Mark is not cutting away from the court scene to talk about, meanwhile things. But Peter is sitting outside the court while this is happening. So while all this is going on, this is also going on. And Peter was below in the courtyard. One of the servant girls of the high priest came, and seeing Peter warming himself, she looked at him and said, "You also were with the Nazarene Jesus." But he denied it, saying, "I neither know nor understand what you mean." And he went out into the gateway, and the rooster crowed. And the servant girl saw him and began again to say to the bystanders, "This man is one of them." But again he denied it. And after a little while, the bystander again said to Peter, see, and after a little while, this was probably a couple hours later. Now we have one of the rooster crows. And while we don't know what two were mentioned by Mark, because in Mark he says for the rooster crows twice, and there are 3 crows of the rooster. And because all of this is happening during the trial, and he's arrested probably before midnight, but we won't know that until we compare all the accounts. It's just good to take a note of when he says that he says this and the rooster crowed afterwards. So the first time he is questioned, he denies and the rooster crows. So this could be the midnight crow. This could be the one before, an hour before daylight. Again, he denied it, and after a little while, also here he denies it, but it does not mention another rooster crow. After a little while, the bystanders again say to Peter, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." So even the bystanders are getting into it, because now this the servant girl of the high priest has gone to them to speak to them and say, hey, he's one of them. And they're all talking to one another, and they chime in, "Certainly you are one of them, for you are a Galilean." But he began to invoke a curse on himself and to swear, "I do not know this man of whom you speak." And immediately the rooster crowed a second time. Or, it's quite possible. I mean, between midnight and the other one, I think these 2 crows, if this one here, when the girl saw him and then starts telling the bystanders, and it doesn't say that the rooster crowed again, because that's not Mark's point. Mark is just mentioning 2 crows. This last one that is mentioned seems like the one right before daybreak. So we're probably getting the midnight crow and the one before daybreak. Give me a second. I'm going to finish this up and then I'll invite you on. Okay. And immediately the rooster crowed a second time, and Peter remembered how Jesus said to him, "Before the rooster crows twice, you will deny me 3 times." And he broke down and wept. Okay. Hello.
Hey man, how are you doing? Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
How are you doing?
I'm doing all right. I've seen you before, haven't I?
You may have seen me before. I was on a few of Rob's streams.
Yes, that's right. How's it going?
I saw you were doing a video. I didn't see it from the start because I was actually away, but I saw you were doing a video on the crucifixion, and yeah, I've been talking to like for the last couple of months. I've been talking to a lot of Muslims, so this is like this is a sore point for them, right? The
Yeah.
historicity of the crucifixion.
Yeah.
So I thought I might just come on and give some give some points that I've noticed, if you'd be
Oh,
interested.
absolutely. I'd welcome it. Thank you.
Yeah, so like obviously, if you're familiar with their understanding of the crucifixion, they don't believe Jesus was crucified. That would
Right.
be the kind of the general Sunni position on the crucifixion, right? They tend to go with Ibn Kathir's tafsir, which suggests that there was some form of substitution which took place, which in and of itself looks like he's deriving from something Basilides said in the first century, right? That kind of theology has like a foundation, back to the Gnostics or something along those lines. Um, but the thing is that like in terms of the data that we have on this, like the historical data that we have and the testimony that we have from the first and second century, I mean, this is as concrete a fact as you'll get. I mean, and that's why we have like so many scholars, right? So many critical scholars, some of whom are atheists, by the way, that have acknowledged, in their works, in their respective works, like Ehrman in his 2008 book and in his 2012 book acknowledges in both those books that for him it's a historical fact based on all the evidence. So like I always find this funny that we have to show them something that should for them be so clear, right? I don't know. Like have you been encountering this at all?
Well, I follow Rob's channel a lot, so I've heard a lot of the discussions. I don't think I've only talked to one person personally, like had a conversation with them who doesn't think it's a historical fact.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing that I could talk about was the small conversation that I've heard. I watched this on a video and I can't remember where it is. I'd like to know where this was, but it was a young historian
Mm-hmm.
being interviewed about it leading to Jesus and things like that. But they were interviewing them very basic things about history, like
Yeah.
how do we decide that something is historical?
Yeah.
And so they gave off this list of things, that are requirements. It's all very textbook stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And and then when they were asked about Jesus specifically, they said, "Okay, well, we have those things for Jesus. So do you believe Jesus is historical?" And they say no.
Oh.
And they said, "Well, what's the difference?" And they
Yeah.
said miracles.
Yeah.
So because of this one little hang up, all of the other facts mean nothing to them.
Uh, yeah.
And the hang up is not relevant.
Yeah.
Now, I watched another historian talk about, a much older historian,
Yeah.
because that one was young, so he's still in that point in his life where he can change his mind and things like that. But this older historian has gone through, uh, the test and the data and stuff for many different things, and they were
Yeah.
talking, about Oswald and Kennedy.
Mm-hmm.
But in the middle of that, they brought up an example to it's sort of like a study example, where you give a scenario to somebody and they have to decide whether or not this shows enough evidence for this scenario to convict this person. It's a bank robber scenario. Have you heard about it?
No, no, I haven't heard about this. No.
Okay. Well, I'm going to tell it terribly, but so Guy robs a bank.
Mm-hmm.
This is the scenario we're given. The information that we have is that the people in the bank saw his face. He didn't wear a mask.
Yeah.
So he's identified by witnesses at the bank. He was caught on camera. So there's even video evidence of him robbing the bank. He is picked up by the police an unusual distance away from the bank.
Yeah.
He is found with most of the money, although some of it's missing. I think out of 10,000 that he took, there's 1,000 missing.
Mm-hmm.
His clothes are clean, but he has blue ink on him.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't have the gun that he used to rob the bank. And a friend of his says that during the bank robbing, he was spotted at a bar across town.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so this is the information that you have. Did he rob the bank?
That's a tough one.
It's not. He robbed the bank.
Yeah.
See, the idea that the challenge there is, I mean, is it a tough question? Because what are the actual facts of that story? Well, the eyewitness that says he was at a bar is not a fact of the story.
Yeah.
He's a clown witness for whatever reason. Either he misidentified somebody or he's a liar.
Mm-hmm.
Because what we do have is eyewitnesses at the bank saying that they saw him.
Yes.
We do have video evidence of him robbing the bank.
Mm-hmm.
He wasn't found with the gun.
Mm-hmm.
So what? That doesn't mean he didn't have it. He didn't have all of the money. So what? That doesn't mean that the money that he has wasn't the 10,000 he robbed from the bank. His clothes, however he changed clothes, he did.
Yeah.
And being picked up an unusual distance away from the bank doesn't mean that he couldn't have made that distance.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Okay. So we have enough facts to say he robbed the bank.
Yes.
Okay, so what are all these other things?
Mm-hmm.
They're just odd details that have to somehow fit in the facts.
Yes.
So what do we have for the crucifixion? We have facts. We have historical facts. We have details that show historical knowledge of these things happening.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And we have eyewitness accounts.
Yeah.
We have enough things to say that that this happened. So what are the odd details? Things we don't understand yet, but they must fit into the facts. Or they're things like clown witnesses and things like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, like exactly as you pointed out there. I mean, the problem, like if you're going to try and work around, let's say, the crucifixion on a historical basis, then you have to go against, pretty much 99% of the historical data that we have in regards to the crucifixion from all the different witnesses from the 1st and 2nd century. Now, look, regardless of whether they were first, second, third-hand witnesses, it doesn't change the fact that the testimony for it is so strong and it's so consistent. That in and of itself is something that you have to question. Like, if you're a Muslim, you have to be like, well, why is the testimony here for the crucifixion so strong, right? And then why is the testimony for our, theological position non-existent, right? Outside, apart from the Gnostics.
They're unfortunately in a position where they're told, like they wouldn't pass the test to become historians.
Yeah, of course not. No.
Unless they're intentionally like lying to themselves in order to pass the test. And that kind of stuff does happen.
Yeah.
But I would imagine that if they were questioned specifically about the method of gathering facts and they use that in regards to the crucifixion, they would still have to deny the facts that they are finding because that's what they are told to believe.
Yep.
And they'll rely on what they're told to believe first.
Yeah, because I don't know if you've seen, because obviously we have, extra biblical stuff as well, like the Flavius Testimonium by Josephus, right?
Yeah.
And the workaround argument there is this. I always find this funny, right? They go with the minority position on that record, which is that the whole thing is a forgery, right? The problem is that that's the minority position. The majority position within scholarship on the Flavius Testimonium is that it is partially interpolated. So in other words, the part where it talks about Jesus being crucified under Pilate, that part they do believe is genuine, and that's the consistent position within scholarship. You may have a small minority over here that might go along the route of saying it's a full forgery, true and true, but that's not the majority position within scholarship. And then the Muslim then will hold to the minority position, because obviously it suits their, their position or whatever. But then again, that's such a mishandling of scholarship. It's such a cherry picking of scholarship, and you're leaning into all the minority stuff. That's really the basis for your evidence, and it's like that's not a good way of going about trying to critically analyze these things. You keep rejecting what the majority position is on it, and then you have to go down to this like minute minority and go with that on like every hand's turn, which is like
also,
it's like
it only handles like a small amount of information of all of the information that we have. Josephus isn't like he's not taking everything. He wasn't there, so he's not taking everything that everyone ever said and compiling it all together and talking about every single thing. There's probably plenty of information that he didn't even have when he was documenting certain things. So you can't, like, even as we don't rely on one person's translation or interpretation of something, we have to look at what a lot of other people have said and connect everything together.
Yeah.
I'm probably guilty of cherry picking certain things, but I want to be called out on that. If somebody's like, hey, no, you got that information from this one source, and here's what is said about that source, and here's what other people have collectively all studied together and held themselves accountable to each other for.
Yes.
Because I've gotten, through solo study and trying to understand certain things, and I barely know any Greek at all, but I'll look at something in the Greek, and what I know is storytelling and writing and things like that. And I'll look at something and I'll go back and forth and try to understand what the Greek is saying. And then I will bring that to somebody who knows Greek and say, is this plausible?
Yeah. Yeah.
and I've gotten a couple times, no, that doesn't work. I'm like, okay, well, all right. Well,
but
tell me why it doesn't work so I understand it.
But there is like an extreme to it with cherry picking, and sadly for me, the Islamic approach falls into that extreme where their form of cherry picking is very, very bad. Like it's very severe in the sense that like when they read scripture, like you're going through those verses now on the crucifixion, you can damn well be sure that there's Muslims that have gone through those same verses that have tried to find some workaround within them to suggest Christ wasn't crucified. Like that's the level of cherry picking that they perform with their eisegesis into scripture. And the reason for that is because, as you said, right, like when you have something that you're not sure about, you'll go and check it with the experts. They don't do that with the Bible. They'll completely mishandle the Bible, right?
Well, they go to the expert, their book that calls itself The Expert on All Things. So if they have a question about something, they go to their book.
Yes, but that's not, you see, the thing is that that's not biblical exegesis. That's Quranic exegesis imposed on the Bible.
Right.
And that's the problem, right? Because when we read, for example, the Quran, if we have let's say we go to chapter 9, verse 5, where it says, kill all the polytheists. And I use that as a statement to say, well, look, they're telling you to kill all the Christians there. Why aren't you doing it? They'll say, well, that's not what it means. Go and check the tafsir. But then my response is, well, check our version of the tafsir on the Bible, which is what the critical experts have said on these same verses. And then that will just, that will remove all these issues that they're running into and misunderstanding what the scriptures are saying. Like that's something that, they have to think about really. And the cherry picking, as I said, it's very, very severe. Like, you just dealt with the crucifixion. I mean, Rob and I looked at the situation with Pharaoh and the drowning of Pharaoh in the Quran. Right. Again, that's another glaring historical error. But what do you do with that? You just pretend that all the historians, all the Egyptologists are wrong and that the Quran is right because the Quran says so. And for a religion that kind of calls itself an evidence-based logical religion, where's the evidence-based logical approach in that? That's completely, blind faith, cherry picking your way, to the solution that you want. You want it to read this way because, you know, if it doesn't, then your whole faith collapses. That's what that is.
Yeah, there was I mean, I've forgotten it, so I might remember it later, but you said something that I wanted to comment on. See, I can't remember it now. Uh, something about because the whole Pharaoh thing and the historical inaccuracy and how they oh it was the French guy.
Oh, Bacot or whatever his name is. Yeah.
Right. Because they find something, they find one thing
Oh,
that can support their argument and will hold on to that.
yeah.
And then, but then any moment where it doesn't support them, they're willing to deny it. Like, oh, that's not what I'm using. I'm not using him. I'm not talking about him.
That's the
So then
funny
what are
thing,
you
right?
talking about?
Yeah, that's the funny thing because if you didn't know better, right? If you didn't know that that French doctor guy that they use is actually not an Egyptologist, that he's a fraud, he's considered a fraud within the field of Egyptology, they could use that on you and you'd be like, oh, okay, it must be true because some French guy, you know, whatever. But if you know better, then actually they'll do what you said, which is they're like, no, I didn't look. At the end of the day, he's not, you know,
Yeah.
I'm not going to him for my information because that's what Muslim Lantern did with Rob during his discussion with him. He did the exact same thing. When Rob knew better that that guy was a fraud, then he dropped it straight away. Like that's like this is the level of cherry picking we're talking about. Like when you finally call them out on their cherry picking, they're I don't really use him anyway. But you were using him all along as like your the spear to your point. It's like, and it's the same with I find this hilarious because I've encountered so many Muslims that like Bart Ehrman is their poster boy. But then when I show them that Bart Ehrman actually like effectively completely demolishes their own religion, then all of a sudden he's not reliable. You know, it's hilarious. Like this is what you have to like engage with.
Yeah, I tell people, I say, look, Barterman does good work. I don't agree with him, but
Yeah.
I'll use his work because he's doing it and he's good at doing it. So I'm okay with you using Bart Ehrman, but
Yeah.
read what he has to say if you're going to use his work.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. Like this is the same Bart Ehrman who says in his book Jesus, an Apocalyptic Jew of the New Millennium. He says in that Jesus used this phrase "Son of Man," and by it he meant a cosmic judge other than God. Now, if you if you hold to that belief as a Muslim, you're not a Muslim anymore because the only cosmic judge in Islam is Allah. And if you suggest there's another cosmic judge alongside Allah, that's it. That's shirk. You've made a consort with Allah. So according to Bart Ehrman, the historical Jesus used that term in that way. Now, are you going to hold his position on that since he's an authority in other things? And by the way, this is the same Bart Ehrman who, believes that the Quran has textual variants and isn't perfectly preserved either. So if you're going to go down that route, then you better be willing to accept his opinions in other areas. Like the one way I like to think about it is either this guy is truly an authority for you through and through, or he's not at all. It's like you have to make a decision here. Are you just going to cherry pick from his research the bits that like support your view, but then when he doesn't support your view, he's magically not reliable anymore? It's just this double kind of standard thing that's just hilarious when you're encountering them on the streets.
Yeah. And I find myself as I've mentioned multiple times as a writer going through these accounts of the crucifixion. And more recently, I've decided that notes are important because if I don't take notes, then I'm just going to forget everything. And even the notes that I did take
Yeah,
have skipped over verses that today are relevant to me. And I wrote these weeks ago.
yeah. I never asked what's your name exactly because I never. Sorry, my apologies for not asking.
Oh, well, you can call me UDT on development team. You can call me Haven.
Haven.
Uh,
Okay.
yeah,
Would you prefer UDT or would you prefer Haven?
it's whatever you prefer. I like
Okay.
by now I have like many different names among different groups of people. I have somebody in my congregation who walks right up to me and says, "Hi, Steve." And I'll tell you, one, that's not my name, but also it doesn't catch me as unusual
Yeah.
because when I was a teenager, somebody called me Steve because they said I look like a Steve, and that caught on. And
Yeah.
so to me, when he calls me that, I'm just like, oh yeah, I mean that's my name to some people.
Yeah.
But I hear undevelopment, I immediately respond. I hear Haven, I immediately respond. I hear
Okay.
UDT, I immediately respond. These types of things, it's just
Yeah.
like this. I would like it to all be connected so that everybody knows when I'm being called one thing or another that it's referring to the same person.
Yeah.
Uh,
And just by the way, Haven, I just want to point out as well, like I know sometimes that when we were talking about these things, it can kind of sound like we're bashing the other group. I don't want it to come across like that. Like that's not what I'm trying to do with this. You know, the
we
purpose
want
behind this
people to
is
be better.
yeah, but I also want people to focus in on what the truth actually is, right? And that might be hard. It might be hard to concede that maybe the position you're holding to is not true. And that's the reason why I do this is because the truth is important at the end of the day. Um, but like, and again, the caveat I'll always extend to a Muslim is this, right? If you can produce to me a Muslim source written by a Muslim in the 1st or 2nd century that confirms the Quranic position of Surah Al-Nisa, verse 157, I'll take my Shahada immediately. They can't do it because it doesn't exist. It's the same thing with, chapter 61, verse 6, where Jesus says in the Quran that Ahmed will be coming after him. Same thing. Give me one manuscript before the time of the Quran where Jesus said Ahmed is coming after me, and I'll take my Shahada immediately. It doesn't exist. Right? So this is always the caveat I'm extending. The reason is because when you and I apply an evidence-based approach to these claims, whether it's the crucifixion, whatever it is, the Quranic accounts, they just do not hold up at all. There's little to nothing to them. Like the only real thing you have for the Quranic position on the crucifixion seems to be found in Gnosticism, because Irenaeus writes about it in his book Against Heresies. In volume 1, I think it's chapter 24, he talks about Basilides' position on that, which was this idea of substitution, which seems to be what Ibn Kathir in his tafsir is ripping from. Now, I don't know whether that position was original to Basilides. It might have predated him by some other Gnostic group. But my point is that the origin for that position is based upon a dualistic understanding of the world, right? That anything which is physical is good, anything which is spiritual is bad. Christ was so holy, he was so glorified that he could not have a physical body, right? And then that's where they developed this narrative from. So yeah, like
I think you mix that up. Anything that is physical is bad. Spiritual is good.
Yeah, anything that's physical is bad. Anything spiritual is good, right?
Right.
Because Christ is so holy, so what's the word for exalted? He could not have a physical body. And like that's the thing, right? That's where that position is stemming from. We know the theology from which it's stemming from.
Yeah,
Predominantly speaking.
that's a very I'm trying not to use comic books here as an example. I don't think I can avoid all of those, but it's that very narrow way of applying like your science fiction belief type thing of some cosmic element or some spiritual element, and saying that there's no reason to gatekeep the physical world from the spiritual world. Like God, and also that whole idea, that whole statement, even when Rob says it, I try to call him out on it. When he says God can't, I was like, I understand what you're saying, but the way that you say it, just to say that God can't, I don't think that's fair. Because one, it's not really relevant to the conversation whether God can or can't do something, because nothing is beyond him.
Yeah.
So if
I
we
think
were to
maybe
just
a
hold
rephrasing.
that,
Yeah, maybe a rephrasing from a cosmological standpoint could be something like never would as opposed to can't. That would probably be closer to the mark. I'm not saying that would be the right answer.
But the idea, like the whole reason that phrase is brought up, God can't do this, is because, and you have to have the whole conversation before that. You have to have, and let's establish some rules that we have observed, not things that we make up. Let's gather the facts.
Yeah.
And according to the scriptures of what God has told us, this is the way he operates.
Hmm.
So operating outside of that is
Yeah.
not something he does. So if it's outside of the way he operates, the
Hmm.
things that he chooses to do, that's what we call the can't,
Hmm.
because he's not going to.
Yeah.
And therefore, if it is, outside of what he's going to do, then he can't do it because it would break his own rules, which he won't do.
Yeah.
And it's like, yeah, but once you are thinking about all of that,
Hmm.
then the phrase God can't this or that, that's fine. But people aren't thinking about all of that. So
Hmm.
I don't think it's fair to say God can't.
But now take what you've just said there and then try and impose that upon the Quranic understanding of God. Because the Quranic understanding of God takes that can't very seriously in a number of different areas, right? That he seriously cannot do these things for
Right,
such and
but
such.
they imagine those types of things. They're not taking it. They're not like saying God can't do this because this is said. No, there's a gap of information. Like,
Yeah.
why didn't this happen? Oh, God can't do that. It didn't happen because he can't.
Yeah.
That's not defended
Yeah.
by saying that. But in the Bible, when we go about that and say, well, why didn't God do this? It's not, well, God can't do this. It's because, well, look at the scenario that is set up by God and what he is seeking to achieve. And then it's like, okay, why were you late for this meeting? Oh, there's a traffic jam. Yeah, but
Yeah.
why didn't you arrive 5 minutes earlier?
Yeah.
The traffic jam. But okay, well, why not 10 minutes earlier? Hey, all the answers are the same.
Yeah.
You're not going to get a different answer out of me. The reason I'm late is the traffic jam. The
Hmm.
reason I'm not early, there's no reason to answer that question. It's the same question.
Hmm.
So why did God do things this way? Because that's the scenario he set up. Well, why not this other way? Well, hold on. I've already answered that.
Yeah.
Because he already set up a scenario,
Yeah.
and all we're doing is observing and recording what he did.
Yeah.
Why did it have to be that way?
Hmm.
Who said it had to be that way? It is the way that
Yeah.
happened.
Hmm.
If you want to know why it had to be that way, well, before the universe began, that's what he decided.
Hmm.
Is that good enough?
Yeah.
No? Then I can't help you because all you're seeking to do is fight. And
Hmm.
if you're only seeking to fight, then there's no point in you even asking me.
But see, this is the problem, right? Like within that conceptualization that you laid out there very nicely, the problem that people will run into is when they try to over intellectualize it, right? It's like they demand an answer for the why not, as opposed to just accepting the why as the answer. And that comes about as a consequence of over intellectualizing these questions, right?
Yeah.
And that's what Islam runs into. It's like their idea of a transcendent is like he's placed within a logical box for them. That it's really it's a conceptualization of the mind that they've placed him into, and he has to fit this very specific box, and he cannot exist outside of it. Which, by the
Let me
way,
give you a
compromises.
let me give you a I know I tried to avoid this, but let me give you a comic book scenario. This is the same extent that somebody has to go to, and I did this uh, in order to say, look, we can't explain this, but here's an explanation. Lois Lane is falling at terminal velocity.
Mhm.
Superman flies in and catches her. How does she just not explode?
Yeah,
Well, we don't have an explanation. It's a comic book.
yeah,
But again, going back to the facts, in the comic book, she's falling at terminal velocity. He
yeah,
catches her. She's fine.
yeah,
So how does it happen? We don't have that information. The comic book uh, storyteller, the writer, or the artist, they didn't give us that information.
yeah.
So what's our position if we seek to understand that?
Yes.
Imagine an answer.
Hmm.
And that's where we fail because anybody can imagine an answer.
Yeah.
and come up with some kind of explanation. And my answer was Superman absorbs inertia. But I could back that up with different
Yeah.
examples of Superman doing different things, like
Yeah.
where he lifts a plane from one point on the plane with his hand.
Yeah.
I mean, how's he doing these things? Well, the powers of Superman are we need Superman to do a thing, therefore he has the power to do the thing.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, what kind of power could catch Lois? Inertia absorption. He
Yeah.
flies in, catches her, absorbs all of her inertia. She's fine. Now, somebody like left a reply on my comment when I said that, and they just said that's BS, and I unsubscribed. But because it's ridiculous to come back at me and just like have nothing to back up saying that's just all
Yeah.
nothingness. But of course it's nothingness. It's a comic book. But the
Yeah.
scenario that we are given through that comic book for Superman's powers are if he needs to do something, if the Great Wall of China needs to be repaired and we don't have the footage, we're going to reuse footage of him nodding to a crowd and saying he has Great Wall of China repairing vision.
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
he does. And then that's just the way it goes. If he needs to tow planets on a chain, he has that power. Now
Yeah.
we can move on. But if you have all those things and then you're seeking to understand something later in the Superman comic of like, well, how's he doing these things? Well, we
Yeah.
have examples to show that he just has whatever power is necessary to move the plot along.
Hmm.
So how is God doing these things?
Hmm.
Well, it's not that he has whatever power moves the plot along, because that's Superman's thing.
Yeah.
What we know for God is, well, hey, let's go look at the Old Testament and his interactions with us and
Hmm.
see what kinds of things he does and why and what they lead to.
Hmm.
You can look at the story of Joseph and his brothers and going to, being sold as a slave and going to Egypt.
Yeah.
Joseph has two dreams,
Hmm.
two different dreams of the same thing.
Hmm.
It is that significant that he has two dreams? Not yet in the story, but wait a minute. Pharaoh has two dreams, two different dreams of the same thing. And God tells Joseph what they mean. And Joseph tells the Pharaoh that the reason that these two different dreams mean the same thing is because God is going to make it happen.
Hmm.
So now we have a reason to know why Joseph had these two dreams.
Yes.
We didn't have that before, but we can look at that and be like, oh, what do you mean these two dreams mean that God's going to make it happen?
Hmm.
Does it have any relevance? Yes, to a previous chapter.
Yeah.
And we could go look at that and say, so God was going to make Joseph be in this position where, the everyone, his family will bow down to him, that
Yeah.
he'll be in this position. Okay, so then we look ahead to something else that God does, like the incarnation. Is there a
Hmm.
reason for this? Yes,
Hmm.
because throughout the Old Testament, God is constantly telling us that we will fall short, that human beings cannot fulfill their side. They're
Hmm.
constantly failing. They're not always intentionally failing,
Yeah.
but and throughout the whole thing, he keeps a line holy. Not holy, but he keeps a line righteous in his eyes. He
Hmm.
preserves a line
Hmm.
for a reason. Abraham's line, because of the promise he made to Abraham, your seed will bless the nations.
Hmm.
And then you go all the way to the New Testament. And what do we have in these genealogies? What's the point of the genealogy? Like
Hmm.
in Matthew, it's to show that Jesus is connected all the way through. He is that preserved
Hmm.
seed that eventually that comes down. And Matthew sees that and relays that information.
Hmm.
Okay, well, Matthew does this a lot.
Yeah.
Matthew looks at things Jesus does and says, oh, hey, by the way, in the Old Testament, well, he doesn't say Old Testament, but he says in the scriptures
Yeah.
and Isaiah, and this and that. Jesus is fulfilling these things. Let me call you back to why Jesus is doing these things.
Yeah.
Because God spoke it.
Hmm.
Because this is how God operates.
Yeah.
Now, can we take those observations and just say, well, he couldn't have done that because I don't want him to.
Yeah.
No, you got to bring me something more substantial. Bring me something that was previously recorded where God says that he cannot do this, or he will not do this, or this will not happen. Then you have something.
Yeah, but see, the Muslim workaround on it, like within their theology, is that they presuppose that there was an original text, and that what we have today is the corrupted variant of it. Therefore, the original message hasn't been preserved, and then the
I'm not interested in that because
Oh no, I'm not interested in it either, because the presupposition for it, there's no evidence for it. You're
but
presupposing a text that we
but it's beyond that.
have.
I brought up the entire idea of this being a corrupt idea, that there's corruption,
Mhm,
because either you you have to say that everything prior is corrupt,
mhm, mhm.
or you have to say that the Quran is corrupt.
Yeah, and the other thing as well is, if you say that everything prior is corrupt, then that means God is extremely clumsy in how he handles his own revelation. I mean, that's something you would have to concede, because you have a statement within the Quran which says he'll preserve this book. But wait, what? He chose not to preserve any of his previous revelation? He just allowed it all to fall into disarray? It doesn't make any sense.
They'll have an explanation for that, I'm sure. I'm not going to give it to them, but if they want to think of it, because I already have a way
Yeah.
of just dismissing that. But what I was getting at is, in regards to, uh, because Rob's making the wrong argument here. The argument is there and it's beautiful, but he's making the wrong argument and he doesn't see it yet. And I told him it, so he might get there. But because he's coming from a position of, this is the earliest mention of the things in the Quran. You have this Apocrypha, you have these legends, you have, like the life of Adam and Eve. You
Yeah.
have these authors recording this stuff.
Hmm.
Okay, well, the Muslim perspective today, when they acknowledge that this stuff existed prior, is
Hmm.
that supports their Quran.
Yeah.
But that is or that is their problem, to say that supports the Quran, because now you're either saying that those authors were inspired, and thus when the Quran does not use it directly, when
Hmm.
they change the words,
Hmm.
then the Quran is corrupt. Or you're saying that that's not inspired, and thus the Quran is just using uninspired information.
Yeah.
So
That's
pick one.
like,
Is it
yeah.
wrong or is it wrong?
Yeah. Yeah, because like the thing is, like, as you rightfully pointed out, every single thing the Quran pulls from, the majority of which, by the way, the overwhelming majority of which is either Jewish apocryphal stuff or Christian apocryphal stuff, it's all redacted. So it's, in other words, the only thing that's going on here as far as changing words is concerned is in the Quran. The Quran's the thing that's changing and altering these texts in some shape or form. Like the infancy gospel of Thomas, right? Jesus
Yeah.
is worshipped in that. Oh, but when it appears in the Quran, there's no mention of the worship part.
Right.
It pulls from the Apocalypse of Peter. And the
So was
Apocalypse
it
of Peter,
inspired work and thus they corrupted the inspired work?
yeah,
Or
so
was it not inspired, in which case they should ignore it?
yeah, so their argument will be, because I had a discussion with Wissam over this. Like their argument is that those apocryphal texts, they their original origin was the Muslim origin, and then what we have today in the apocryphal form is a corrupted variant of it. So they don't believe that anything that the Quran is drawing from is the original. It's all a corrupted version of the original. But again, the presupposition for this is what the Quran is saying, without there being any evidence for it, preceding the Quran. Again, as someone who looks at the evidence, this I just cannot follow that. I can't follow an argumentation where there's zero evidence to back up anything the Quran says. Again, you're presupposing an original text that doesn't exist. We have no, again, this is my caveat, right? If you could produce to me the original of whatever the Injil is, or whatever you're saying the Torah is, or whatever you're saying these apocryphal texts were before they were corrupted, and produce that to me from the 1st, 2nd century, then I take my shahada straight away. But they don't exist. None of these texts exist.
But wait a minute, we do have that. And hold on, I'll go ahead and say something. I got a train coming.
Yeah, that's kind of just what I was trying to get at, is that, like, if you're gonna make arguments that what we have today, like even the apocryphal stuff, is a corrupted version of the original, right? Again, this so-called, they keep going back to this so-called mythical original text that doesn't exist for all these different sources. If you could produce that original text that you keep talking about and that your Quran keeps harkening back to in some shape or form for the from the first or second century, then your argument would have weight. But they don't exist. These documents that the Quran talks about do not exist. Show me this Injil. Show me this Torah. Show me this uncorrupted version of the infancy gospel of Thomas. Show me this uncorrupted version of the apocalypse of Peter. They
Right.
don't exist.
So this is what I want to point out on that. That if they want to say that these apocryphal works are corrupted, I agree. They are corrupted versions of the truth.
Yeah.
But the truth that they are corrupting is what is in the Bible.
Yep.
And early writers, early commenters point that out.
Yep.
They mention that these are corruptions.
Yes.
They're heresies. They're called out for it. We don't have to wonder what these things were considered in their time.
Mm-hmm.
And they talk about what is actually written in them. Mm-hmm. So we know that those haven't been changed.
Yeah.
So you can say, all right, so the infancy gospel is the infancy gospel that it was. The one that we have now in whatever form is what it was when it was written. Mm-hmm. Okay. It was called a heresy. Okay. Mm-hmm. It is a corruption by that. All right, I agree. Why are you using it? Why is this thing that is a corruption in any form in your Quran? Because there's no way of trusting any of that information. Now, we do have a way of pointing out what in that is the truth that they're basing most of this on.
Yeah.
Because the things that are agreed upon are in the Bible.
Yeah.
So if the Bible is the standard by which we can see that something is or is not a corruption, mm-hmm. then we can use the Bible to do the same thing with the Quran in the same way that we look at something like the infancy gospel. Mm-hmm. But no, can't.
Yeah.
Can't.
Yeah, but when you bring up the infancy gospel of Thomas as being a corruption of the truth, which it is, by the way, the Quranic interpretation of that would be then that effectively what you have is a corruption of a corruption. Like, it doesn't make any sense. Like, because the original text would have been the uncorrupted version of this so-called corrupted truth. But the funny thing is that we have testimony from the early church fathers who talk about, like, the groups that these texts originated from. Like, we know where they were sourced. Right. This presuppositionalism that takes place in Islam is just mind-boggling, because
But then it gets into the idea. Okay, if what they're writing in these apocryphal texts, like they're basing it, a little bit on truth. We have information of who wrote this and when. That's why I get into this challenge of, like, well, is that inspired? Because where else did they get the information? Where else did they get the information? If you're going to claim that they're the first author and that the truth in it is what's in the Quran, then some of it is inspired because it's not written elsewhere.
Yeah.
And if it's inspired in any way, you either have to take it as what it is because it's the same then as it is today, mm-hmm. or say that all of the information that is agreed to be a corruption is a corruption, but that's what you're using in your Quran. Mm-hmm. So you're stuck with saying that by association, mm-hmm. your Quran would have to either be corrupted or corrupted. But and I have to go in a couple minutes, but I wanted to show, as I begin this study of the crucifixion, trying very hard not to apply prior knowledge and prior teachings and things like that. Just go through and take notes of what I'm reading and try to understand what I'm reading as I'm reading it,
Yeah.
uh, it's going to be hard because throughout the whole thing, I'm like, oh, and in Luke, he says this, he adds more information.
Yeah.
In Matthew, there's more information there. Those things are kind of important
Hmm.
to study.
Yeah.
But as I'm just going through Mark, I just want to understand the the key points, the things that I could consider facts as I go along.
Yeah.
The biggest example there would be that they say it was 2 days before the Passover and the Feast of Unleavened Bread,
Hmm.
and then there's a meeting to arrest Jesus and kill him, and then Judas goes and speaks to them and becomes part of this conspiracy, and then from then on seeks to find his opportunity, and
Hmm.
then uh, Jesus sends two of his disciples to go prepare because it is the first day of unleavened bread, and that day is called the day that they sacrifice the lamb, and
Hmm.
that's the day that they prepare the room for the
Yep.
meal, and then that evening they have the meal.
Yeah.
So and also that evening, they after the meal they go out, they sing a hymn, they go out to the garden, and then also that evening Jesus tells Peter that Peter will betray him that evening,
Hmm.
and then Jesus is taken to trial that evening, and then when the sun comes up, Jesus is crucified.
Hmm.
Those are just like bam, bam, bam points
Yep.
that you can lay out and put in a timeline and say, this happened this day, this
Hmm.
was that evening, this was the next day. And hopefully I can put out a whole list that eventually leads to Pentecost and Acts, which is 50 days later.
Yeah. Yeah, I just wanted to like, but like for us, it's like this is such, this is such established facts, this is such established information. But I really like that the way you're going to go through, the four gospels and kind of line up all the facts with each other, like historically speaking. That's very useful. I just wanted to drop my 2 cents on the whole kind of, the veracity of the historicity of the crucifixion, because it's
Yeah.
it's such a frustrating thing that we live in a time when we actually have to like convince people that this is something historical. Now it's one group of people, but they comprise 2 billion people of the entire population of the world, which is
Well,
quite a huge amount.
I forget who is the reason for this, but I said I've talked directly to somebody
Yeah,
who doesn't think that the crucifixion is historical or that Jesus is historical. And I tried to explain to them that the consensus, even among secular scholars,
yep,
is that
yep,
Jesus was a real person and that he was crucified and that
yep.
he died as while being crucified. Like that's the consensus. And they said no. I was like, what do you mean no? Like
Yeah,
who are you getting this information from?
yep.
Because I would stop listening to that person.
Hmm. Hmm.
Uh, but that was a completely different conversation. I have no idea what their position is today.
Yeah. Oh, but look,
Uh,
if you've pointed them towards the data, I mean, there's no refuting it. Because as I said, like this is the majority position, as you pointed out. The reason that it's the majority position is based on the first and second century testimonies that we have surrounding this whole thing, and
yeah,
it's
that's
so
important. There is a reason that these things are believed
yeah.
and are in scholarship and things like that. It's the same, and I heard this. I think Rob said this. There's a reason the gospel is attributed to this person.
Yeah, yeah. That's you see this. Again. I don't want to get into that. That's a whole separate thing within source criticism, is whether the gospel writers wrote it or whether they were
Right.
anonymous. But if you say they were anonymous, then come up with a second and first century justification for it, where you can actually give us evidence as to how it's anonymous and why it's anonymous. The problem is that there's no external evidence in that period to suggest that they're anonymous. So that would
Right.
lead me to believe that the attributed names on them are the actual names of the authors themselves. I have
Yeah.
no other reason to believe. There's nothing else I can believe unless you can produce a second century document where a church father says, "Okay, guys, we just added these names on because we wanted to give them a bit more oomph." But that document
Yeah.
doesn't exist.
Well, also look at why we have these names,
Yeah.
because I just you're not going to be the first person. I could read through Matthew and then conclude, like, without Matthew being the title of it. I could read through that gospel and conclude that the author is Matthew based on what's inside of it.
Mm-hmm.
Just say, hey, I think Matthew, who's in this, is the
Yeah.
one who wrote it.
Yeah.
But I'd still have to read Mark and Luke and John first to
Yeah.
come to that conclusion, especially because, and this is just a theory of mine, because I think Matthew is not Levi.
Mm-hmm.
I think little James is Levi.
Mm-hmm.
And I think Matthew and Levi were both tax collectors that were both called and probably had to live in the same house because
Mm-hmm.
of how they were shunned from the community, which means that little James was a tax collector. Now, this is the reason I get this. When you're reading through and you see a disciple called one name,
Mm-hmm.
and then they're called another name,
Yeah.
there's a callback to the prior name. There's
Mm-hmm.
something connecting the two names. Levi is never connected to Matthew,
Mm-hmm.
but Levi is connected to somebody else by one tag, where Levi's name no longer appears.
Yeah.
You see the tag appearing, but it's not applied to Matthew.
Mm-hmm.
It's applied to James,
Mm-hmm.
because Levi is the son of Alphaeus.
Mm-hmm.
James is the son of Alphaeus. Matthew is never called the son of Alphaeus.
Mm-hmm.
Peter, Simon. Simon, Peter. When Simon's name is different, it's Peter, but it's Peter,
Mm-hmm.
or it's Simon who was called Peter.
Yeah.
There's a callback there.
Mm-hmm.
Thaddeus, whenever there's a name change or somebody's called by a different name, there's a tag that says who they're talking about.
Yeah.
So when James is called the son of Alphaeus, that follows along with, hey, remember who the son of Alphaeus is? This is who we're talking about. We're talking about Levi.
Mm-hmm.
But Matthew doesn't do that.
Yeah.
And Matthew is mentioned as one of the 12 alongside James in the other Gospels.
Yeah.
And in Matthew.
Yeah.
So Matthew's not alluding himself to Levi. It could also, I could just say, it's very easy a confusion of who the tax collector was called in this moment. But I still think that further evidence shows that Jesus was called out for dining with tax collectors.
Yeah.
And so there was more than one tax collector.
Mm-hmm.
And that dining experience, Matthew's house,
Mm-hmm.
or Levi's house.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
But it's things like that. I mean, you're going to find these types of consistent patterns within the writing that show you information, and you can do the same thing with Jesus referring to himself as, the Son of the Blessed, or the Son of Man who does these things, and all this stuff. You can clearly see how the author is saying that these statements are Jesus identifying himself.
Yeah, you see, the funny thing about the Son of Man is that it's used 94 times in the New Testament. Like that's a huge amount of times that Jesus attributes this title to himself. So it's not really a kind of argument you can work around by suggesting that it was an interpolation, because it's very clear that he consistently refers to himself in this way. And since that on a purely historical basis, like the historians, some of whom are atheists, will accept that he was an apocalyptic Jew. If he was an apocalyptic Jew and he was let's say drawing from Jewish apocalyptic literature, that Son of Man theme was massive in apocalyptic Jewish literature. It would stand to reason that he'd be attributing this title to at least someone, whether it's himself or someone else. So like the evidence would suggest that he had to have used this title in some shape or form. And as you rightfully pointed out, like the gospel writers consistently attribute it to one of his own sayings about himself, Therefore, that would lead me to conclude it has to be self-referential.
I'm wondering today what kind of terminology we would have that he would draw upon to call himself, because he wouldn't be using Son of Man, because that's not relevant to us in our cultures today. But he might call himself like the One.
Yeah. I
Like,
wonder
I
if there's even
am
something
the
stronger
One.
than that. Yeah. I wonder if there's something even stronger than that. Because you know, if you're trying to get people to think of you as the second power in heaven, it's like, well, what would be like a modern day equivalent of that? I don't know. I don't know what he'd say. He would know. You know, he would know what to say if he was here. You know, in the flesh. But yeah, that, you know, that phrase, it's a well attributed phrase. And again, like, it's funny with the Muslim thing, right? The Son of Man thing. It's like you don't want to accept that when the gospel writers claim that about Christ, that he's the second Yahweh, he's the second power in heaven. It's like, dude, it's very clear what he's getting at here. Because that theology, you know, it's so well established within critical biblical theology, that there's no workaround for that. You know, the statement's very clear. He's claiming to be the second power in heaven. You can't work around that.
All right, I gotta go. So
Oh, yeah.
I'm gonna end the stream real quick. Thank you for joining me. If you did, stay safe out there, Commonwealth. I'll be back with a part 2 as soon as I can.
All right. All the best, Haven. Take care.